Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're unpacking a really provocative book by Rob Skelton called The Future is Upside Down. The core premise here is absolutely fascinating. There's an impending, massive demographic shift headed our way, and it's going to force us to fundamentally redefine our entire global economic system. The author argues that capitalism, at least the way it currently operates, is simply not built to survive what's coming over the next few decades. It's a bold claim for sure, and whether you ultimately agree with it or not, the macroeconomic concepts explored in this text are absolutely worth your time to understand.
So here's our roadmap for exploring these ideas today. We'll start with the 2050 population tipping point, move into the limits of modern capitalism, look at a history of inequality, examine what the author calls the inefficiency of greed, and finally, wrap up with transitioning to a hybrid future.
All right, let's dive into Section 1, the 2050 population tipping point. Mark your calendars, because the year 2050 is a crucial milestone. According to conservative estimates from the UN, right around 2050, the global human population is going to peak and then actually begin to decline. Think about that. For the first time in modern history, we are going to have a shrinking human population. In prosperous nations, we're already seeing fertility rates dip well below that magic number of 2.1 babies per woman required to just maintain population levels. Now, right now, these countries rely heavily on immigration to keep their numbers up. But Skelton points out that eventually, as those other countries develop, that talent pool is just going to dry up.
Which brings us to this critical kind of mind-bending question Skelton poses. What exactly happens to capitalism when the population actually starts to shrink? I mean, our current capitalist model is entirely dependent on continuous, perpetual growth. If you have fewer people, you inherently have fewer consumers, right? Capitalism has literally never existed alongside long-term negative growth. So how on earth do you keep corporate profits growing when your customer base is shrinking every single year?
And this creates a really wild central paradox. Because for the physical planet, a population decline sounds like an absolute ecological utopia. It means more resources per person, way less strain on the environment, just a healthier world overall. But for our current debt-based capitalist framework, it spells disaster. If the population shrinks, GDP shrinks. Housing demand just drops. Skelton makes a great point here. No bank is going to give you a 30-year mortgage on a property that is mathematically expected to continually drop in value. So if you're banking on your house endlessly rising in value for your retirement, this structural shift matters a lot. The system basically breaks down into a permanent recession.
Which brings us to Section 2, the limits of modern capitalism.
To really understand why this 2050 tipping point is considered so dangerous to our current way of life, we have to look at the author's diagnosis of today's economy, what we might call peak capitalism. Skelton reaches back nearly a century and pulls this amazing quote from the legendary economist John Maynard Keynes. Back in 1930, Keynes predicted that within 100 years, the core economic problem of basic human survival would essentially be solved. And Skelton argues that Keynes actually hit the nail on the head. We have essentially solved the basic physical production problems of humanity. We can produce everything we need cheaply and easily. Yet instead of kicking back and enjoying that low-work, high-leisure utopia Keynes imagined, we're locked in perpetual toil, honestly working longer hours than ever. The author makes this brilliant contrast between our very real human physical limits and the concept of infinite wealth. Think about it. As biological beings, we have limits. We only have 10 fingers to type with. We only have one stomach to feed. You can really only practically live in one house at a time, right? But wealth, specifically stored wealth, has absolutely no natural limit. People can and obviously do accumulate billions of dollars. Skelton uses this to illustrate what Aristotle actually called the unnatural accumulation of money. Basically, we have strict physical limits, but our economic measurement system just doesn't.
And this infinite measurement system ties perfectly into his critique of GDP. The text points out that we are basically slaves to a statistic that values all the wrong things. Look at it this way. If a massive natural disaster strikes and levels a town, spending millions of dollars to rebuild it actually boosts the GDP. It looks fantastic on a spreadsheet. But on the flip side, babysitting your granddaughter all afternoon has immense, profound human value, yet it generates absolutely zero GDP. The author argues that our obsession with endless GDP growth is just a fundamentally flawed way to measure the actual success of an advanced society. Moving right along to Section 3, a history of inequality.
Now, if you're thinking, well, massive economic systems can't just change, Skelton pivots to history to show us they absolutely do. It's important to remember we've faced structural economic crises before. He uses this striking quote from the ancient Greek philosopher Plutarch to remind us that this is not a new conversation at all.
Over 2,000 years ago, it was widely recognized that extreme wealth hoarding and intense inequality were historically fatal threats to any functioning society. The point here is that we aren't some special exception to history. If the imbalance gets too severe, the whole shebang eventually shatters.
Check out this timeline to really put our current moment into perspective. You've got the first Gilded Age leading up to 1929, think robber barons and just insane wealth concentration. Then, bam, the Great Depression hits and acts as this incredibly painful economic reset. But notice that period from 1947 to 1977, the years of shared prosperity. Through active government interventions, things like the GI Bill, heavier taxation on the ultra-rich, expanding homeownership, the wealth of the middle class rose at the exact same rate as the wealthy. Inequality actually plummeted. But today, the text argues we've completely unlearned those lessons and we're heading right back to massive inequality and the endless hoarding of stored wealth.
Let's jump into Section 4, the inefficiency of greed.
Beyond the system just being unfair or imbalanced, the author introduces a concept he calls the inefficiency of greed. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about how much of our modern human energy is just squandered. We spend massive amounts of our collective societal energy fighting over resources. We hire absolute legions of accountants and lawyers solely to protect our wealth or figure out loopholes to extract it from others. We employ endless security forces. We spend billions running advertisements just to trick people into buying one product over an identical competitor. Skelton argues that if we all just did what was genuinely needed for a satisfying life and shared the spoils, we'd probably only have to work half as much. This constant, relentless battling over capital is wildly inefficient.
Finally, Section 5, transitioning to a hybrid future. So how exactly do we prepare for this 2050 population drop? Skelton proposes what we can call a hybrid economic system. He argues very strongly that we have to move past these rigid, polarizing labels of pure capitalism or pure socialism. Those labels just bamboozle people. Instead, he says we need a pragmatic blend that acknowledges we already happily use socialist policies like public libraries, unemployment benefits, and paved roads. The goal here is a system that prioritizes universal basic living standards, intentionally limits extreme stored wealth, and, this is the key, is structurally designed to function perfectly well without perpetual population growth.
Breaking down the blueprint, he lays out a methodical 25-year rollout. Step 1 is the implementation of what he calls a stealth UBI, or Universal Basic Income. This sets a floor of minimum living standards, ensuring essential workers are fairly compensated, and honestly just giving people the power to walk away from inefficient, low-paying jobs. Step 2, a massive cultural shift. We have to change this deeply ingrained view that a family home is just a financial investment vehicle designed to endlessly appreciate. And Step 3 involves legislative actions to put a cap on the endless accumulation of unspent, stored wealth by the ultra-rich. Now, because these ideas are obviously radical, Skelton insists on a slow, 25-year transitional timeline so we don't completely shock the economy. I want to leave you with this incredibly provocative thought quoted in the text from economist Kenneth E. Boulding. Anyone who believes that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. It just perfectly encapsulates the core message of this whole book. As our global population inevitably peaks and then declines by 2050, the infinite growth model is going to hit a brick wall. So the ultimate question the author leaves us with is this: what do we actually want our future economy to look like when that day arrives? Do we want a chaotic crash, or do we want a managed, intentional transition to something new? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope it sparked some fascinating thoughts about the road ahead.